David Starkey, welcome to Thinking Class. Thanks so much for joining me.
A pleasure.
Well, David, it really is my pleasure, and I don't think you need too much of an introduction. You're one of the most eminent historians that we have on these British Isles, and you're known far beyond those. And you've written much about the importance of understanding history, understanding the importance of the crown to the nation of England and Great Britain. And we'll be exploring some of those things today. But let's begin with historical understanding, because you say, and in fact you write on your website, that history properly taught is the basis of our civilization. What do you mean by that?
Uh, Very simply, a civilization is a kind of group self-consciousness. It's a group memory. We're peculiar, the civilization of the West, because we have a double memory. We have our own and the memory of particularly Greece and Rome, but to a lesser extent, I think, and I would argue to an exaggerated extent, of the world of the Bible, of particularly the Old Testament and so on, lying behind that. And the way that I can best explain this is if we go right to the beginning, what I would regard as our modern culture. Um, I'm doing all terrible things like semi-omitting the Middle Ages and whatever, but we'll go back to those at various points. And it's the moment at which we conventionally talk about the beginning of the Renaissance. And it's the moment also, which again it's worth thinking about, of really the invention of English. Because what we forget is English is a very, very modern language. It only goes back a few hundred years. It only, in anything like its recognizable form, it only goes back to the late 14th century, to the time of Jesuit Chaucer, in the very, very 1380s, 90s, whatever. And Chaucer's an extraordinary man. He's the founding poet of English. He is to English what Homer is to Greek, or Virgil is to Latin. The point was actually made later on. And he invents English, this strange fusion of French, Norman French, and what was left of the original Anglo-Saxon, the Germanic language of England. As part of this process, it's his encounter with the new developments, or newish developments, in Italy, France and Italy, more particularly Italy, where he goes there as the diplomat, which we call the Renaissance. That's the rediscovery of the literature, the thought, the politics, the history of Greece and Rome. And the poem in which he celebrates all this, it's very characteristically English. It's deadly serious and it's a joke. It's called the Parliament. Listen to the idea: the Parliament of Fowls, the Parliament of Birds. And what's happened is he describes his encounter with one of these rediscovered texts, the great work of Cicero, The Dream of Scipio, from Cicero's De Republica, which is his great text, Cicero's great text on the Roman Republic. And The Dream of Scipio is the climax of this thing. It's the vision of Romanitas, of the Roman world. And he reads all about it, and but you know what he does? He goes to sleep. He gets bored, and he has a dream. And instead of the world of politics and national glory and whatever, he dreams about a parliament, which means exactly then what it does now, of birds, not arguing about warfare, not arguing about taxes, not arguing about who is right and wrong, but arguing about love in the full Liverpudlian sense of the term. But there's one marvelous quatrain, that's to say, two couplets in this, which I think is right at the beginning of what I mean by our civilization. And he's obviously encountered this ancient text. It's bred something new in him. There's been a response. And the way he describes it is, just as each year from the dead coal, I'm translating into modern English, just as each year from the dead coal ground, new corn springs up, so from old books, new science, new knowledge comes. In other words, it's the Burkean idea of Burke talked about a civilization, a culture, and politics as being, yes, a contract, but a contract between the generations, between the dead, the living, and those yet to be born. A civilization is the same. It's that process of accumulated memory, of the refinement of discourse, of the survivals of buildings, of thoughts, of a landscape which human beings have shaped. And the way that we understand that is essentially history. And again, the uniquest thing about us, the West, particularly Britain, England, where it all starts, is the very idea of history. No other civilization has this fully blown notion of the description of events in time. You won't find it in Chinese history. You won't find it in Japanese. It is, again, one of the astonishing uniquenesses of our civilization. Yes, the Romans had it. Yes, the Greeks had it. But in nothing like the same sophisticated, developed way that we do. So history is the very foundation. The first thing, I've been a teacher for most of my life. The first responsibility of the teacher is to transmit. You're a vehicle through which cultural experience flows. It is the terrible problem when we just put the emphasis on, as it were, the creativity of the child. The creativity of the child is merely solipsistic. It's merely self-referential. It's got to be in dialogue with that inheritance. But of course, as that wonderful quote from Chaucer tells us, this isn't strangling. This isn't limiting. This stops you reinventing the wheel. Our modern notion of educational self-discovery merely means every child, if they do anything at all, wastes endless time reinventing the wheel. And again, the terrible mistakes that we make all the time are because we as adults don't really think on either our own history or the history of our society. At the moment, I mean, Britain is going through its Dreyfus moment. We're realizing that the horrors that indeed I've been dealing with today, the horrors of Southport, the horrors of the grooming gangs, these are our Dreyfus case. They are the mark that the very structures of our society have simply stopped working. Mutual trust, mutual respect has been lost. A very sense of who we are, what we are, why we are. The relations of the governed and governed have broken down to an extent that it may even be irretrievable. It's something very, very terrible. But it's happened before. I lived through it in the 1970s, the winter of discontent. Exactly the same thing. But do you know what? Modern politicians are not looking back. We are going through, as far as I can see, an entire rerun of the 1970s. The problem is that generally speaking, when we look at current problems, we reach for isms. Or whatever. We reach for economics, we reach for sociology, we reach for models. The whole thing as incarnated in that most destructive degree in the curriculum, PPE at Oxford, the catastrophe of PPE. Whereas the obvious way to begin to understand the human condition is, what have other human beings done before? It's not terribly difficult. Now, this doesn't mean that it's a magic solution, but it's where you start. It's where you begin. So, and again, it's peculiarly true in Britain. We have a historic constitution. Again, if we look at that pre-moment of our civilization back to the world of Greece and Rome, and particularly to the world of Greece, the great founder text when it comes to politics, well, there are two of them, of course. There are the analytical texts of Plato and Aristotle, but the key moment, it seems to me, is in Thucydides, the historian, describing the the great Athenian leader, Pericles, giving that first funeral oration of the Peloponnesian War, in which he begins talking about what are we? What are we as Athenians? We are a democracy. This thing shapes us. It shapes everything about us, but it's the invocation of a common memory, which leads to a common way of doing things, and I'm using common in the sense of things we have in common, not vulgar, to common set of values, values in common. And it's a profoundly historic sense of what you are. It's why, if I want to get people to try to understand England, the first thing I will do is take them to two places, to a little parish church and to Westminster Abbey. And in those buildings, if you can't sense something greater, a past that's not dead, that's there, that's underfoot, that's in the smell, that's in that curious, rich light. I call it historical transcendence. I'm an atheist, but at those moments I feel something. And do you know what? Again, one of the disasters that we've made is the abandonment of literature. It's in literature, which itself, of course, is a historical artifact. It's a record of the past. It's a written record of something that was done long ago, sometimes quite recently. And if one looks, I've mentioned Chaucer, I mentioned Thucydides, but if you look at somebody like T.S. Eliot's marvelous poem, Little Gidding, is all about that experience in a parish church, a little parish church, in Little Gidding, as the light falls, winter's afternoon. History is now and England. And he talks about the sense of footsteps, heard and not heard, that are the tread of centuries, that are people dancing, people loving, people fighting, those bodies in tombs, you know.
I hate to bring us down from what was
To
a
earth,
very rousing,
to earth.
a rousing opening.
And what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to get people. The trouble is, history is taught usually so terribly. Recitations of lists of dates. People associate it with something boring, deracinated, inhuman. Not.
Well, absolutely preaching to the convert here. The thing that I think will bring us crashing to earth is touching on the lack of historical understanding or curiosity amongst our political class, almost of all stripes. And so I wanted to ask you a question about that. There was a GB News interview between Stephen Edgington and Liz Truss last year. He asked her, outside of Winston Churchill and Margaret Thatcher, who her favourite Tory leader was, and she searched around, couldn't think of anything, said, but I like Javier Milei. And then we have a Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, who's asked what his favourite literature was, what his favourite poem is. He says, I don't have one. And he even said that he doesn't dream. Considering that they are the progeny of this cultural heritage, which you just so richly described, how worried should we be that our political class don't have any understanding of what came before, or even the richness of our past, that they can't find anything in which to understand on it?
We shouldn't be worried. We should be terrified, because they are utterly at sea. Without a knowledge of the past, you're at sea without a compass. You're walking in a street without your Google map. You're lost, as they are lost. And it's the sense of, Starmer is the most interesting. Here is a man who has never read anything apart from a legal textbook and an Arsenal programme, trying to deal with the horrors of Southport. Let's just look at the horrors of Southport and see how we could, with the frame of reference that I've been talking about now. Why have things gone so scandalously wrong? See, I don't subscribe to the argument there's been some vast cover-up. I don't believe that whatever this creature from Rwanda is called is some sort of serious Islamic terrorist. I don't believe that for one single second. I think he's something else. And I think also the focus of both sides on ideology has been completely misconceived. It is, of course, because when we want to look at terrorism, and you can see this, we'll just talk about it because it's a wonderful example that brings to the fore every single thing that we've been talking about. What is it that Keir Starmer is saying terrorism is? Well, he's saying, of course, it is a matter of ideology, of isms, of abstracts. What does Prevent say terrorism is? It's a matter of ideology and isms. What is left out? Is left out bloodlust. It's left out why Axel, reflecting on it immediately afterwards, says, I'm so glad they're dead. 6 years old. So happy. It's that terror of the dislocated mind. You won't find that in United Nations definitions of terrorism. You won't find that in the remit of Prevent. You won't find that in an act of parliament. You will find it if you read Dostoevsky, if you read, it's called The Devils, the Possessed, the Demons. It's the first novel about terrorism, and it points to two things. It points first to that bloodlust, just want to kill. Then it talks about the isms. What we've done, we've assumed it's the isms that produce the bloodlust. Dostoevsky is wiser. It's the bloodlust that latches onto the isms. And this is where we've gone completely wrong. This astonishing record that we have of Axel. How many times has he been referred to Prevent? How many times has he been referred to the police? The answer is very simple. Why doesn't Prevent recognize this man manifestly wandering around with knives? Ringing the police up and saying, what do I do if I want to kill somebody? It is going to school with a hockey stick to smash somebody over the head. Oh, but he doesn't have an ideology, so he's not a terrorist, so we needn't worry about him. And the police, it was fascinating. The Daily Mail did an astonishing, as it so often does, an astonishing piece of reporting. I don't know whether you read it this morning. The detective inspector, whatever he was called, in charge of the case, saying, we recognized it was terrorism. Remember, if it hadn't been for modern medicine, 12 of those girls would have been dead. 12. It's a mere miracle. It's a genuine massacre. But, the rules say it can't be terrorism because he didn't have an identified ideology. So in other words, it's not that the state was consciously covering up. Yes, there was an element of covering up because we know in appearance it looked like any other Islamic terrorist incident. But the ideology, I think, in all of these fits on top of that basic bloodlust. You see the point that I'm trying to get at? And instead what we have a routine of mere bureaucracy. We can't call him a terrorist because he doesn't put his hand up and say, Allahu Akbar. There's no evidence that he did. He doesn't have the beard. He has, and forgive me, he has none of the usual signs for the good reason they're not there. And his reading about horrors was entirely indiscriminate. It was anything that's really horrible. Any form of torture, massacre, ethnic cleansing, whatever. It's the bloodlust. Yes. The only thing I would regard as being central is misogyny and a strange fascination with little girls. But then we've seen that's very characteristic in the grooming gang thing as well. But it is the failure of what we see is not wickedness, and it's really important. Everybody's been saying, "Oh, the failure of that's gone wrong with the grooming gangs is it's wickedness, it's conspiracy." It's not. It's bureaucratic rigidity. It's legalistic rigidity, which of course leads to the other absurdity. Did you not read, my dear friend, Jacob Rees-Mogg was actually subject to investigation by Prevent. Why? Because he read a dangerous, ideologically loaded text, Rudyard Kipling, Empire, White Man's Burden. You see the total I mean, somebody is infinitely buttoned up and respectable. There isn't room for a bladed knife inside poor Jacob's double-breasted suit, He's got absolutely nowhere to put it. But these ninnies, because they operate in a mere world of legalistic definition. Again, Starmer, his extraordinary behavior over suits. I followed the rules. This is a man whose framework of reference are the terms and conditions of a mobile phone contract. And he's trying to govern the country on the basis of that, which is why he's as sociopathic as Elon Musk, but without Elon Musk's wonderful creativity, enthusiasm, joy in life, sense of a civilization so great that he's got to rescue it now and take it to Mars. It's the opposite form of sociopathy, the awful, rigid, desiccated, a world of dried peas.
How do you think we got here? So we've got this rich history which stretches back a couple of thousand years, and it was largely passed down through the generations. And I was speaking with Ed West, the historian and journalist, recently with his colleague Paul Morland about their podcast, The Canon Club, where they try to introduce people to some of the key figures and the unheralded figures of the Western canon, because they believe it's important that we understand our cultural heritage.
What I try to do with David Starkey Talks, exactly the same thing. What I've been trying to do for the whole of my life, what television used to do very well.
You will indeed. And we spoke about Kenneth Clark's Civilization in 1970s, excellent introduction to it all. And Ed always makes the point that the civilization that lasted from, say, medieval times up until the outbreak of war in the 20th century is recognizably the same civilization, and then things change. How is it that we ended up becoming so impoverished in our historical understanding? Because I feel like the generation or two above me have a pretty solid understanding of what this country is, its key figures, its key moments, its key events. And I felt like as a millennial, I had to relearn or learn all of that stuff in my late 20s, and it was only then that I understood what it meant to be an Englishman and a British person.
Because it's historically conditioned. Right. I think there are two explanations. There's a very big one, and there's one that's entirely local to the teaching of history. I went through because I'm so ignorant. I've just celebrated my 80th birthday. I am history, a living fossil. Isn't it amazing? I take you back to 1945. Now, what went wrong was my generation again. It's my generation, and I'm going to use the brutal word, that fucked up. It's really important we understand this. Hand in hair of guilt. We fucked up partly because we became experts. If I think of how I was taught history, most of the people who taught me weren't experts. They hadn't done their PhD. They had a broad civilizing view. They thought they should teach me big sweeps of European history, big sweeps of British history. And the central subject I was taught was the British Constitution, was the actual entrenched development of our politics. And what my teachers again thought they had to do was to give me a great map of time, that that sense of those 2,000 years that you talked about. I realized, partly from my own experience, let me tell you what happened. We all started doing PhDs. A PhD is that tiny, tiny little bit. Do you know what happened? When I went to London in 1972 from Cambridge, there was, when I went there was a marvelous history degree. You to do the big sweep of English history, British history, it meant English history, of course. You to do big sweep of European history. You could do some world history, you could do history of America, and so on. You began clearly with big narrative courses, and then you got a little bit more specialized in one subject in your second year. And in your third year, you did a special subject with proper documents and all the rest of it. Great. Then, of course, we all sat down. I, David Starkey, have researched the Privy Chamber of Henry VIII. I am privately going to teach the Privy Chamber of Henry VIII because I'm bone idle and I can't be bothered to do anything else. And the result, and we all reconstructed the curriculum around our specialist interests. There was this at university, it began at university level, as these things usually do. It was self-interested. It was, of course, justified in grandiose terms, as you can imagine. We're introducing people to new ways of approaching history. We're taking them nearer to the documents. All of that stuff. But basically, it was because we were lazy. And then it developed in an even more dangerous way, an ideological way. The decision that history should be taught through documents even at school level, that what we should be doing when we're teaching history at school level was teaching people to be historians. Deranged. What you should be doing, of course, is giving them that broad understanding. Instead, I cannot believe it. You give 12-year-olds bits of historical documents. Of course they can't understand them. You can only understand a historical document if you have some inkling of the world that produced it. It's completely the wrong way of going about it. And again, the leaders of the profession, I shall name names, people like Richard Evans, the Regis at Oxford, led the way on this. I remember a Newsnight debate with him in which, when he just said, there's no reason why people should understand the history of Britain. What we should be doing is teaching them to be historians. I was so shocked that I didn't debate with him properly. So that's been the thing. And of course, it was then stirred into all sorts of things. The history of Britain is a history of oppression and all the rest of the stuff. But it began with those two things. It began at university level with the over-specialization and teachers reluctant, really, to learn much beyond what they'd learned already in their PhDs, and teachers themselves increasingly without breadth of knowledge. Then there is the focus on the teaching you to be a historian. Also the disbelief of narrative history, that what we want is analysis. And then there's something much bigger. The 20th century modernism is about the deliberate destruction of the past in every area. Again, I've written on this in the form of a little pamphlet, but colouring the whole of my thoughts. Again, art, this is when we go back to Kenneth Clark and civilization, which he did not fully get himself. Modernism is destruction. Marcel Duchamp, the famous urinal, which is exhibited in New York at the end of the First World War, is intended to be the destruction of art. In the Dadaists and whatever, round about 1918, 1920, in response to the horror of the First World War, said all art is meaningless. Duchamp is perfectly clear. All art is meaningless. You should use Rembrandts as ironing boards. I am not an artist. I am an artist, like anarchist. I am opposed to the very idea of art. Modern art, as we understand it, is only invented in the cupidity and folly of 1960s New York. Similarly, modern architecture, modernism in architecture, is intended to destroy everything that had gone before and did.
Mm.
Modern classical music is intended to destroy everything that had gone before and did. In other words, modernism isn't this new movement of creativity. You look at it, you look at a Tracy Emin, you look at Damien Hirst. This is shit in the face of the public. You look at the mess we've made of our cities, the horrors, the cult of ugliness. Everything is ugly, is deliberately ugly. Again, one of the essential problems with Britain is our terrible decision at the end of the Second World War to rebuild in modern style. Why does nobody want to live in Manchester or Birmingham? Because they're ugly. They're vile places to live. I was at the Conservative Party conference in Birmingham earlier last year. It is the most hideous place on God's earth. Apart from a few fragments of what Joe Chamberlain tried to create, magnificent classical buildings, it is just ugly, and it doesn't even work. The stupid conference centre that we were in, the only way they could fit security was when you went through a security gate and then walked another 100 yards in the pouring rain. It's not even, modern architecture is supposed to be efficient. It's not. So modernism was about the deliberate repudiation and destruction of the past. Now look at where there's economic growth. Everybody says, why are continental cities lived in a way that ours aren't? Because they either weren't destroyed, as in France, because France ran away from the Germans, or, as in Poland, country now absolutely booming, Hungary about to be so, they rebuilt their cities beautifully. Do you know what is the place in Britain which has the fewest people out of work?
Oh, I think I read this the other day. You'll have to remind me.
York.
Yes.
Utterly untouched. I couldn't believe it. I was there just before Christmas. It made Oxford Street look like, what it does, the third world. Absolutely booming, bustling, because it's a lovely place to live. Bath, Brighton, Edinburgh, much of London, where I live. They're attractive places. This is why the notion of Hull, Bradford as the city of culture. I mean, the sheer lunacy of the idea. But if you compare and contrast with what the 19th century tried to do with those cities, with the heroic quality of the buildings, even the cotton mills of Manchester, as Lowry shows, are magnificent. And look at us. So again, this deliberate deracination of a culture in the name of progress. And again, this notion that we become this bizarre utopian. We assume we can simply invent everything from new. I mean, again, the horrors that's gone wrong with our politics is Blair. We're a new country. What? We have the oldest continuous, or had before he got his horrible hands on it, but the oldest continuous political system in the world. Nowhere else. I mean, our political history until 1997 is genuine, continuous from Magna Carta, and you could argue even from the reign of Alfred. And then there is the equivalent. I mean, Blair is the equivalent of Marcel Duchamp, though without the talent. This deliberate rupture, this notion that started again.
Do you think people understand just how big a break that was that you've just described? Do you think that's within the public consciousness?
No,
or
I think this is what I think is happening now. I think there is a sense. This is why I've talked about this as a Dreyfus moment, like the terrible anti-Semitic case in Third Republic France. There's a moment at which you realize that marvelous phrase, there's something rotten in the state of Denmark. There's a great deal rotten in the state of Britain. And there's a dawning sense nothing works. Nobody tells the truth. You're in a world of words, absolutely detached from things. You see, again, history properly done is the most thingy of subjects. I mean, I had, I am an administrative a financial historian on the one hand. I'm also a historian of the royal court on the other. And my great teacher was Geoffrey Elton, German, one extraordinary man, part of that diaspora from Nazi Germany, Jewish, of course, though very secular, but a man who had no sense of history apart from words. And his great thesis was, in the reign of Henry VIII, for heaven's sake, Thomas Cromwell made government less personal. In the reign of Henry VIII. And I would say to Geoffrey, come on, Geoffrey, what was the day that Thomas Cromwell explained to Henry VIII that he was surplus to requirements? I think it's 2 days before he was executed by a deliberately inexperienced executioner to make sure, in that wonderful phrase, he knew that he was dying. Or, again, even administrative history. I mean, I know it's hard to believe, I'm rather a good financial historian. And the revolution that I brought about in the understanding of financial history, or indeed administrative history generally, was to say, these are not just figures, or these are not just words or seals. They are the result of real people doing real things in real places with real objects. And until you've worked out that, you will not understand it. But the problem is, and this is, we're going back to Starmer and whatever, the left in particular just believe in a culture of words. The absurd dispute about Elon Musk and doing that. What rather that? Oh, it shows he's a fascist. Here is a man who has just spent £44 billion making sure that X has freedom of speech. I don't think freedom of speech was very high on Adolf Hitler's list, but it's this. It's looking. The entire left is about words and gesture. Similarly with me, when I was done for being a wicked racist, because at the height of Black Lives Matter, when everybody was claiming slavery was a genocide and the entire history of Britain had to be written around slavery, I'm afraid my tongue tripped and I said, so many damn blacks. Wouldn't one do so? Rather than looking at what I was actually saying, the fact that one had used a no-no word. So we've become religious. We now have rather than a politics which is based in reality, we have instead a political theology. In which get the tiniest word wrong, tiniest gesture wrong, and heresy to the stake, cancellation. And again, look at extraordinary things like transgenderism, gender self-identification. As I constantly point out, this is purely medieval, isn't it? It's transubstantiation. If I say hoc est corpus, miraculously, the chunk of bread has turned into flesh. If I say, oh, but darling, I'm really a girl, despite my Y chromosomes. You see what I mean? It's again, it's this, something has gone radically, radically wrong. And I think it's this deracination. Again, modern architecture is purely theoretical. Buildings are constructed by algorithms. They're constructed by equations. Something terrible has happened. But what I'm hoping is that the sense of disintegration, of decay, of malfunctioning, of a state that is both ever more costly and ever less effective, that the more it tries to do, the worse it does everything, might force us, A, to think, B, to look into the past, and above all, to examine yourself. Because again, one of the key things about history, and it's striking, isn't it? So many people say, they come to me, or come up to me all the time. I used to be completely bored with history when I was young. Now I've got old, I've got quite interested. You can see they're not quite sure why. And of course, the reason is you become aware of yourself as having a history, as being part of it. You become, of course, profoundly aware of mortality when you don't, again, lie to yourself about it. And these again, the whole way academic history has developed, its refusal to look at art and or the art of language, its refusal to embrace emotion. Good history is, of course, it's scholarly. It's based, again, I've always taken a pride, even when I was doing vulgar television, that you work really hard to get it right. You work really hard to get the facts right. I believe there are things called facts. Again, one of the things that's most terrible about the 20th century, the fashionable, all coming from France, of course, all bad ideas of French, postmodernism, and then enormously amplified through the power of American academic life. That's where everything has gone wrong. But the attack on the idea that there is truth, the great there are, again, we need to understand the extraordinary achievement of late 17th century England, empiricism, the fact that essentially there is a fact that things exist. Dr. Johnson, in the face of Bishop Berkeley's denial of reality, kicked a stone. There are hard things, and we've got to rediscover that. The extraordinary achievements of the late 17th century are not due to deductive thought. They're not due to Cartesianism, beginning with big ideas and coming down. They're due to minute observation. The apple, the little prism by which you split the beam of light. It builds up. It is inductive, not deductive. History is the most profoundly inductive of subjects, the thingiest. And again, it's why I'm passionate about people being interested not simply in history. You need the words, you need the chronology, you need the documents, but they acquire a quite different meaning if you look at the history of furniture, the history of buildings, the history of textile. One of the great revelations for me was having been trained by Geoffrey Elton at Cambridge, this intense focus on the document, on getting that right, was coming up to London and meeting a marvellous old queen, Hugh Murray Bailey, who was, again, this kind of rather old-fashioned, well, certainly an old-fashioned sort of homosexual. He'd been in the Marines, for God's sake, in the Second World War, helped put together the entire cultural inheritance of Nazi Germany, which had all been sort of salted away in salt mines. And he regaled me on magnificent stories, like, what did you do with the 14th century Madonna when you only had 6 strapping chaps and a 10-ton truck? How did you put a fragile wooden Madonna in a truck and not have it wrecked as you were trying to take it back? Okay, lads, take your belts off. And suspended as all his lads are rather nervously shifting as he looks at them lustfully. Anyway, but what he taught me was you can actually understand a royal court through understanding the layout of a palace. All the work that we've now done on Downing Street and the White House, why is it called the West Wing? It's a place. It's the proximity to power. At last, people have started arguing, where was Sue Gray's office? How near are you? It's physical. And it's this sort of thing we've got to understand. Again, the physicality of place, as I was talking about.
We've talked about the deracination of culture, the loss of understanding of our literary history, and even the cultural practices, how they're created by real people. And when you talked about how modernism was this not just a break from the past, but an intention to sweep it away and move on to something new.
Like
As
it's our fascination with revolution.
mm,
Revolutions are catastrophic. It's the again this middle class kid, and oh, isn't it sexy with Che Guevara? Isn't it lovely? Wasn't Cuba marvelous? It
mm,
wasn't. It's a horror. Every revolution makes things worse. That's true of the French Revolution as well. France has never re-established political stability. Look at the mess they're in now. 5 republics, 2 empires, and 2 monarchies in just over 200 years. The catastrophe of the Russian Revolution, the catastrophe of the Chinese. We can now see it. Putin is just another awful expansionist Tsar. Xi or Qi or whatever he's called is another mad emperor. Nothing has changed. The techniques and technology has changed, but the mental attitude hasn't. But again, the whole of the cultivation of human rights is another disaster. It assumes as a universal human being, rather than the fact that we're all rooted in our cultures.
mm,
Again, leftism is all based on an idea there is a universal human being. Ergo, as we see with Lord Herman, the Attorney General, there shouldn't really be a state. We shouldn't really have frontiers. Exactly what's being reacted against so effectively by Trump in America. It's the same thing. It's the denial of the thing that shapes us and makes us. Even when you don't want it, it's still there.
mm,
And but the point is, these things are not. They're seen as straitjackets. It's this recognized completely by Edmund Burke with the French Revolution. The desire to make everything new is the most destructive thing you can do. And tragically, we embarked on that course in 1997. And in terms of our cities, we embarked on it in 1945. I mean, I think we've got to recognize that the entire history of Britain broadly since 1945 has been a disaster. There needs to be a recognition that there was an inflection point, and it was terribly, terribly wrong. A few people gifted with astonishing foresight, Corelli Barnett and the Audit of War and whatever, recognized that at the time. All the rest of us deceived ourselves. I lived through all of this. I'm a sensitive historian. I knew Blair was going to be terrible. I've never got as drunk at any party as I did on the election night party in 1997. I knew it was going to be dreadful. But it's only really in about the last 4 or 5 years, very much aided by my own cancellation in 2020, that I become aware of this. This again is something else, John. The historian, why do we get so much better as we get older, he said boastfully, because we've had the experience. Unless, you've buggered up something in your own life, unless you've been in love and been rejected, unless people close to you have died, you don't really understand those things. And it's most influential history, because it's a product of a PhD, is now written by very young people. And they're writing, if they're any good, out of deep reading and deep knowledge, but shallow experience. I mean, what we call experience is just our own history.
Thinking about what comes next in our modernizing drive to make everything new, I can't help but look at the monarchy, being an Englishman and a Britishman. And I want to ask you a question. Once I've quoted a passage from C.S. Lewis from you, to get your reaction to this and what it might mean should we lose the monarchy. C.S. Lewis wrote, "Monarchy can easily be debunked, but watch the faces. Mark well the accents of the debunkers. These are men whose taproot in Eden has been cut, whom no rumour of the polyphony, the dance, can reach. Men to whom pebbles laid in a row are more beautiful than an arch." On the modernising front, David, what would it mean for the country of Great Britain to lose the crown?
Well, the crown, I'm afraid, is busy losing itself. That's the most terrifying thing. The coronation of King Charles was a self-conscious rupture. It is the first coronation since, I commented on it at the time and got much abuse. It's the first coronation since 1689 when Parliament wasn't present. In other words, the coronation, as King Charles reinvented it, with the aid of the now man known to be dreadful, Archbishop Welby, that coronation seemed like a merely private religious act. It had no connection whatever with the way that we are governed. This is a catastrophe. We're a parliamentary monarchy. The king seems completely unaware of the fact. I would argue it goes back, I'm afraid, to the reign of the blessed Queen Elizabeth II. Queen Elizabeth II, in my view, although she was very dutiful about her red boxes, fundamentally abandons her role as the centre of politics after the whole business of the succession and the fraught succession to Harold Macmillan, when there was a whole debate about would it be Butler or would it be Douglas Hume, and she takes such fright after that she effectively abandons her proper role as constitutional monarch. And it's compounded by the fact that she fetishizes the Commonwealth. This is utterly, utterly disastrous. It prolongs our imperial hangover. And of course, the Commonwealth increasingly becomes what, in my view, least matters historically, Africa. Whereas what mattered, of course, were the great realms, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and behind them, America. So the monarchy itself has, in my view, handled itself disastrously. And William is a perfectly decent chap, but nature intended him to be the manager of a second division football club.
Can you imagine?
No, I'm sorry. So I think it's become absolutely marginalized. And again, you see, and it's really important we recognize how fundamental the marginalization is. We are not a nation. Britain is not a nation. We are a pre-modern state. We were the union of two monarchies, Scotland and England, with radically different histories. The only bonds of union between them were Parliament and the monarchy. And the bond of parliaments was broken by Blair and devolution quite deliberately, in my view. And the only thing that used to make you British at home, you weren't British. When you constantly see this terrible word Brits and Britons are naked and daub themselves in woad and fight the Romans. But what happened was that the only definition of being British was that you were a subject of the crown. This sense of direct loyalty to the monarchy has been completely lost. Again, it's hugely accelerated under Blair, deliberately by Gordon Brown, in which what you do instead, you try and invent being British. But you can't invent being British for the simple reason, if you go back, which are the first soccer internationals? Who are they between?
England and Scotland.
England and Scotland. Do you see what I mean? You were British abroad. It was the British Empire. You were English or Scots or Welsh or whatever it was at home. And the what happens in the 1990s is, instead of loyalty to the crown, you try and define British values. And what on earth are these British values? They're totally vacuous. They are tolerance and diversity. In other words, anything goes. So because we've ignored this extraordinary, delicate tapestry of historic rival allegiances and hugely more in common, because really the differences between England and Scotland are paper thin, as James VI and first points out, when the first agitation for union comes from Scotland. Him back at the beginning of in 1604-5-6, arguing passionately in Parliament for union. But what you do instead, you replace this wonderful, delicate fabric of identity with something, Britishness, which is no more than a flag of convenience.
David, I think we have scratched the surface here and there's so much more to go. However, there is one more question I want to ask you before we ask one question from the subscribers, and it'd be great to also hear about what you're working on, but we'll get there in the fullness of time. So my final question to you, in front of the paywall, as it were, is what have you changed your mind about in the course of your life, and what was it that made you think differently? It's been an absolute pleasure. I really meant it when I think we've only just scratched the surface, and I hope one day I can speak to you once more to get deeper into this. It's been easily one of the most rousing discussions I've had. I don't really know what else to add to that other than I've deeply enjoyed it, and I'm very, very grateful that you've come on, and I'm sure all of the listeners are too. So take good care of yourself, and hope to speak to you again in the future.
I shall endeavour to do this programme again immediately after my 90th birthday.
Excellent. I look forward to it. And you'll still be as sharp, no doubt. Lemon juice on the brain.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Bye-bye.
Bye, David.